Welcome everyone to another observability clinic, unleashing the power of Events APIv2 integration scenarios with your DevOps tools. I know we're going to see a lot of cool things today, like we're going to see some GitLab, we're going to see some Dynatrace, some cloud automation, some SLOs, and all of this thanks to my guest. Arijan, how are you?
Thank you for introducing me. Yes, my name is AJ. I'm a lead technical product specialist here at Dynatrace.
Awesome. And
So
you've
today
been,
we're gonna, yeah,
you've been a repeating guest because you've done some great work already. So folks, if you're new to this and if you've never seen it, check out the other things that AJ has already done. And especially around automation, around Monaco, you've done some great stuff. I'm sure we'll hear about it. But today, we talk about Events APIv2. I don't want to steal your thunder, just letting people know in case you have questions. Reach out anytime to either of us. You can also leave comments either on YouTube, if you watch it on YouTube, or on Dynatrace University. But now, sorry to interrupt you. I'll let you go now.
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so Events APIv2. Why are we talking about this? Well, the events allow us to push context into Dynatrace about our deployments, our releases, configuration changes. All this feeds our Davis AI to provide enriched root cause analysis. So let's kind of discuss what the Events APIv2 is, if there's changes between V1 and V2, and then we'll walk into a solution that I put together that makes use of the Events APIv2. So first of all, I kind of walked through it, but here's the agenda. We'll talk about Events APIv2, release monitoring, release validation, and then finally the solution for release automation, feeding context into Dynatrace about your pipelines. So just a quick kind of peek at what we're going to look at. Here is a scenario where we have a problem with context of a deployment to provide your app support information when deployments occur, and if those deployments eventually lead to problems. And then a little peek at the solution that we came up with. So first of all, like I mentioned, there is going to be a migration between the events V1 and V2 API. So we just wanted to make sure we make you aware of that and what those changes look like. This has been marked for deprecation at SaaS version 243 and Managed 244. What does that mean? Typically 6 months to a year from the point it's been marked as deprecation, it will finally be end of life. So only Events V2 would work. So I just want to make sure we're aware of that. What does this look like? On the left here, we have the Events V1. This is a JSON payload for the Events V1. And then on the right, we have the Events V2. So there's some similarities like the event type. We support the same event types as we would in the V1 with V2. That has not changed. What has changed is actually how we are pushing the event to the entities in Dynatrace. Previously with V1, you were forced to use the entity IDs with a combination of tags. That's no longer the case with V2. We are using the entity selector. We are able to simply use a tag for given entity types, and that event will then be pushed to that entity type. So the idea of keeping track of your IDs is no longer your job. And then finally, some of the deployment types. So in this case, we're dealing with a deployment, so some of the properties have also changed. And now, instead of living as a attribute within the root directory, there's going to be a separate properties directory, which has all the properties for your deployment. So yeah, so that's the change. Simply the payload itself has changed. The functionality behind the events has not changed. And this will create a release to that process. It will create a release in the release inventory and visualize all the context of a deployment to those processes.
Cool. And maybe AJ, just
Yes.
thanks for bringing this really to our attention. It was actually you driving this to make sure that we are communicating this correctly. While this is an example here for the deployment, there are other use cases on how we have told our customers in the past to use the Events API. So whoever has integrated any type of their automation tooling with Dynatrace, right, make sure that you start earlier or sooner rather than later to think about migrating your REST calls from V1 to V2. And I think that's
Yeah,
just
exactly. I mean, getting into the holidays, freezes start to happen. We don't want a scenario where during a freeze, the events breaks and now you're stuck. So
yeah,
definitely get early on those changes.
exactly.
Yep. And here's a good visual in terms of what needs to be changed. Fairly easy. It's just the payload itself needs to be changed and then switch out the endpoint. Okay, and then like I said, we will continue to support multiple event types. Here's just an example of those event types. And Andy, I think you wanted to speak on this a little bit more.
Yeah, because I talked with one of our product managers, Wolfgang Beer, who has also done tutorials with me in the past. He just
Okay.
reminded me that, you know, there's different type of events that you can send to Dynatrace. Now we are going, and you in your later demo, you will focus a lot about the custom deployment event, which has some special features or enables special features in Dynatrace, but there are other events as well. And I want to just highlight this. So on the top right, on the right side, you can see there's like availability, performance, resource contention, and error event. So the reason why these events are there is so that you, from an external tool maybe that you may have that detects availability events or performance events, think about a load testing tool. If a load testing tool identifies a performance problem from the outside, you can even send this into Dynatrace and then let Dynatrace open up a problem ticket. That would be one thing. Or availability event, if you have an external synthetic monitoring tool and not using Dynatrace for it, you can have this synthetic monitoring tool actually send in an availability alert, right? This will then open up a problem ticket in Dynatrace as if Dynatrace would detect it natively, and then you can use all of the great integrations that we have in terms of problem notifications. Other ones that I want to highlight here is the add context. So this is the deployment. As I said, we will AJ, you will look into this in more detail, but there's the annotation, configuration, and info, and I just try to add a couple of examples. So for instance, configuration should be used whenever you make a configuration change in your environment, like you're turning on a feature flag, you're changing the load balancer, you're making a DNS configuration change. Any change that you add to your system is an event that you should send to Dynatrace so that it then empowers Davis to actually include that event as part of the root cause. And the last I want to highlight on the bottom is the marked for termination. That's an event that is truly useful, especially in environments where you on purpose shut down, let's say, VMs or processes, so you can let Dynatrace know about an intentional termination of a host or process so that Dynatrace will not raise an alert on that process or host no longer be there, right? This is just something that you will put into your Terraform scripts or into your cloud automation scripts or your Ansible scripts to let Dynatrace know about an intentional shutdown. More details also in the documentation. But yeah, that was something that I wanted to highlight here.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think definitely there's going to be a lot more documentation on all these events and all the properties that each event would support. So definitely look out for that. So yeah, so let's focus on the custom deployments, events, and release automation. So firstly, how can Dynatrace, or what does Dynatrace support with regards to detecting a version change or release? The first way Dynatrace can support detecting a version change is environment variables. These 4 environment variables can be added to your containers, to your processes. If Dynatrace if the one agent the one agent is looking for these environment variables, if it sees them, it will pull them into Dynatrace on a restart of your process and then create a release for you in Dynatrace. The next option is in the Kubernetes environments, Kubernetes labels. We support these 2 labels if again, the one agent identifies that these labels are part of the process or your pod deployment files. It will pick these values up and create a release automatically for you. And then finally, what we're talking about today, the Events Ingestion API v2. Again, the custom deployment is the event type we're going to use. And on the payload, you'll have the properties section, and the properties is where you're going to define the properties of your release. So the name of the deployment, the version of your deployments, the stage, product, and then the overall project. Once this event is triggered, based on this entity selector here, that's the process that, or the processes that will get this event, and then a release inventory item would be generated for those processes. Any questions on those three things? I think we offer 3 ways to do it.
Exactly.
This one is the least invasive, right? Because you're simply using the Dynatrace API. There's no changes you're making to your deployments, anything like that. You're just maybe gathering the information and then sending it to Dynatrace.
Exactly. And maybe one thing, I'm pretty sure you show it later on.
Yes.
The properties are like, these are the Dynatrace properties that we suggest you put in as part of the deployment, right? So we can get some specific metadata. However, what I've seen people also add here is, for instance, a link back to the pipeline. You can add things like the Git commit that triggered that deployment, who owns that deployment, I don't know, like a team affiliation or something like this. So you can really add any type of additional property that gives you more metadata and more context about who or what actually triggered the deployment, which will later on, in case of a problem or in case of a failed release validation, give you exactly the data, who to contact and who kind of triggered that change. And I think that's just great to know. So the properties is just, you can add any other custom properties to it.
Yeah, so the ones that start with DT are the ones that Dynatrace will support in terms of it will functionally do something. Like regards with these groupings of events, this will trigger a release inventory page, but the key can be anything that you want it to be. It doesn't really, there's no constraint after the fact. You can add as many properties as you want here. Okay, so that's the detection strategies that we support, those 3 environment variables, Kubernetes labels, and then finally the Events API v2. So now let's take a look at the Events v2 and specifically what each property kind of ties back to with regards to the process and eventually the deployment that will show up on that process. So firstly, there's the type of event you're sending that will be linked back to the DT event group label here. The process group or the entity selector will match the properties of our process. So in this case, we're looking at a process group instance and a process group instance with the tag product easy travel. I guess I linked the wrong one, but it's right there. Similar idea. And then the properties themselves. In the event, you'll find the deployment name matches the deployment name, the version, the stage, the product, and then finally the project. So this is the payload that we're sending, and then this is the result of that payload, querying the entities and then sending the event with these properties. Once that event is sent into Dynatrace, as long as we have the event type as custom deployment and we have the properties for the release, the stage, the product, Dynatrace will automatically identify that and create a release in the release inventory for you. And then for each process group, there will be a dedicated release details page that gives you all the information about the release and the context of the processes that are related to that release. So here's the context of the release and the process, the processes that are within this process group, the events that are being sent to this process, and then finally, we'll take a look at this, but the ability to validate the release and the results of that validation in context of the release. So why are we sending, what's the benefit of sending these events into Dynatrace? Why is it important to have context of your deployments within Dynatrace? I've worked with several customers, and most of these customers are app support. And it's happened many times that I've asked during a problem analysis, has a deployment happened? And the answer is always, we don't know. We will reach out to our dev team and figure out if a deployment has happened. That's quite a lot of time you're spending figuring out if a deployment has happened while a problem is occurring. So having the context of these deployments alongside the problems in Dynatrace would provide you that much more freedom to figure out what the actual issue is, because now we know there was a deployment and there was a problem that associated to that deployment. So now there's that context that gives our app support more freedom to work with problems without having them tied to to our dev team, right? Because we're no longer bothering the dev team. We know that deployments are happening. So what does that look like within Dynatrace? So here, given a problem, given that business impact of that problem, the impacted entities within the root cause, if the Davis AI engine identifies there's a impacted service that has a root cause, and that service is part of the reason behind the problem, and furthermore, there is a deployment event that shows up on that service, Davis will pick up that information and link it back into the problem card under the root cause analysis, giving your app support context of deployments alongside the business impact. So now, instead of questioning whether or not a deployment has happened, we know a deployment happened, and at the time that the deployment happened, Davis identified this problem and who it affected, in this case, a high impact to a big part of our business. So now we're, instead of spending the time figuring out if a deployment happened, we're able to show you within the context of problems. So that's the big goal with the Events V2.
And
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, first of all, I told you earlier, I need to learn from you how to make all these cool animations in PowerPoint. But this is just perfect, because you say, right, there's an impact that Dynatrace makes us aware of, a business impact, but now we know exactly which pipeline was responsible for this particular change that was then leading to the problem and then impacting our customers. And here, as I mentioned earlier, you can add additional information like the Git commit, the owner, the build number, who approved it, and it depends on whatever tool you're using. In this case, it's a ServiceNow, I think, example where you have ServiceNow as a change management tool. But if it is any other pipeline tooling or any other configuration change tool, just send the information in the more context you send in, the easier will it be for, as you said, the support people to say, okay, who do we need to contact? Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
Perfect.
All right. So the next part here is actually validating releases. Dynatrace does support this with our cloud automation offering. What does that look like? First, we send a sequence, in this case, the evaluation sequence, off to Cloud Automation. This will query the SLIs. You could give it a dashboard to query. You can give it some set SLIs. It will query Dynatrace, find the entities related, and then run the evaluation. It will finally calculate a score, a single score that represents the overall SLO of all these SLIs, and then send Dynatrace the events of the evaluation. These events will query based on these set tags, or whatever tags we define in something called the dynatrace.conf file. The event will show up in Dynatrace, in this case, the evaluation results, in this case, the evaluation passes. Now with releases, this actually shows up in context of the release detail. So we'll now see in the releases all the validations that have occurred and the results of those validations.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the complete picture. We'll go into our demo next.
And maybe before you jump into the demo,
Yes.
I really like what you, like in the previous slide, you talked about how in case a problem happens in production, with the additional context about the deployment, we know how to better react to a problem in production. That means problem happens, Dynatrace tells us which changes or which deployment is responsible. Here now, you're actually going like a shift left approach, and you are becoming more proactive, where we say we have a new release that is coming through. Before we maybe leave it in production, or before we even promote it into production, we are going to take Dynatrace and let Dynatrace evaluate or validate if the release is good enough by looking at SLIs and SLOs and calculating a score. And this score, however, will again be presented on that release validation dashboard, so that you really have everything in one place. What is deployed, where, by whom, what was the evaluation result, and that's the nice thing about it. So it's like shifting left. And for the folks that are listening in, obviously you can take a step-by-step approach and start with the just sending the event in, and then move into adding this additional piece, which I'm now really excited to see your demo and all the stuff that you build around it to make this even easier.
Yep. So just one step closer to fully automated, right? We want to reduce the time we're spending figuring out these problems. So let's catch them before we push them into production. And this is an automated way to do that, is running the evaluation of our releases and then tying that back into the pipeline itself. So it's fully automated. Yep. Yes. So now going into my demo. So we've pushed out a couple other solutions. This is just one more cloud automation solution we've provided. Release automation, automating the automating the events being sent into Dynatrace for our releases. So tying into the Events v2. With the Events v2, we can automate releases without changing your deployments or changing anything about your the way you're doing your releases, simply adding one more step that will send or will fire off this solution, and then that will provide your releases, the context of your releases into Dynatrace. And then there's two different versions of a dashboard that you can generate. I will show you what that looks like in our demo.
And also I want to highlight here quickly, you can go ahead, if you're watching this, the stuff that you're showing and that you're calling the solution, this is something that you have built based on a lot of the feedback we've gathered from customers, also those that are in our Cloud Automation Guild, which is a special group of people that meets on a regular basis. We learned a lot on how our users are actually using Dynatrace for automating releases, and we try to make this easier. And if you're watching this either on YouTube or on university, the link to, especially later on, your GitHub repository is also in the description of this video.
Yes.
So check it out.
Yeah, just a little bit about that. I mean, the biggest thing is visualizing and dashboards and automating those dashboards. Most, if not all, of the solutions result in a dashboard that gets automated for you. So we'll take a look at what the dashboard for release automation looks like. I think it's always helpful to have a visualization, and to automate that is what most, if not all, of our solutions do. So looking at the demo, so I've set up a quick GitLab pipeline that will do these 4 things. It will mimic a deployment of my application. It will notify Dynatrace of the application by running the release automation solution. This will generate that dashboard and send a deployment event to Dynatrace. And then the next step is actually validating the deployment. I'm making use of the on-demand synthetics, where I can trigger a run of a synthetic monitor in Dynatrace to validate my deployment. That's one of the steps of the pipeline. And then finally, using Cloud Automation to validate my deployment, I will fire off a sequence to Cloud Automation, which will validate deployment and then send that information or that context back into Dynatrace. So obviously you wouldn't be doing this manually, but I can take a new version of my application, so 1.13. This is all information that will be provided in the GitHub, what each one of these things means. Here I have the release automation job, the validation job, and then the release validation job. So I've made my change. My dev team has built a new version of my application. I'm now ready to fire that off. I will commit my changes. This will fire off the pipeline. So as the pipeline is running, again, the first step is to fire an event to Dynatrace for the release information and generate a dashboard for me. The next step is to validate that deployment by executing an on-demand synthetic.
Mm-hmm.
Once that finishes, it'll finally then use. So this is pretty much data. So we're feeding data into Dynatrace by doing this step here.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you could do it with your stress testing or whatever you currently do to feed that data. As long as we have Dynatrace monitoring your application, we'd be able to gather that observability data in Dynatrace and then validate on that data. So we're using Dynatrace to feed our validations here. So let's see where we are with this. So each one of these jobs builds off of a Python image. So it looks like the release automation job just finished. We are looking at this. This is our payload that we generated. In this case, version 1.13. Part of the script is to validate against some of the entities that are related in the release. So I automatically find all the services and processes that are part of this release and generate some SLIs for you. And then finally build out the dashboard. What does that look like in Dynatrace? So let's look at the dashboard itself. So here's that dashboard, and I dynamically identify the version here. So I have the project, the stage, and the product that's part of this deployment. This dashboard will visualize on the left here all the processes that are part of this deployment, and then all the services that are exposed. And then each one of these tiles has been automatically baselined in a way where there's a SLI and some thresholds defined. And then I have it linked here, so I'll just navigate through the dashboard, but I can go to the process via this link here. This will take me to the process to which I sent an event. There's a couple of events that I've sent so far. So let me just bring down my time frame to the event that I just sent. So here's that new deployment event I sent, 1.13. Here's all the properties that we need to link this back to a release. In the dashboard, I also have a link to the release, so we can quickly see what the release or the context of the release. So here is my process group, and here's one of the instances of my process group where I've sent the latest version, 1.13. So that's the release automation. It's to send the event, generate that dashboard, and then Dynatrace will automatically generate this release inventory page for you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, let's make sure so the next one was to validate the deployment. Again, we are making use of the on-demand synthetics to run a stress test of our application to make sure the deployment functions and there's data to trigger an evaluation on. So what does that look like in Dynatrace? So going to synthetics. Easy, this is my synthetic that I'm triggering the on-demand analysis for, or execution for. Here is the on-demand execution, and here's the one that I just fired off. Looks like we've succeeded. From an availability standpoint, it passed. Now let's test how this duration, was there any performance impact that we introduced into our application with this new release? So that's the next step of the pipeline. That's the release validation. So we're going to use, again, a sequence sent off to Cloud Automation to validate this release. So again, here's that payload that we're sending off to Cloud Automation to say, here is a new deployment that I want you to validate. Going into Cloud Automation, I landed on the page here, but here is that sequence that we just fired off. We can see we actually passed, which is great. That means we gathered all the SLIs. I'm doing this via a dashboard, but you can do it via the default SLIs. And then we're validating against the conditions of those SLIs and then evaluating a overall SLO score. Once the evaluation happens, we're going to fire this event back off to Dynatrace. So then going back into Dynatrace, let's see, we should have sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. If it takes too long, I can have another validation run fire off. So while we wait for that, I'm just gonna start another one. So the idea is we have the release context in Dynatrace. Now we want the context of that validation in Dynatrace.
Hey, AJ,
Yes.
can you quickly go to your pipeline? Because I just want to
Sure.
rephrase what you've just shown, because for me, this is truly fascinating. The visualization is nice. So, folks, this is typically a classical pipeline. So you deploy, that means you're deploying your new artifact, but additionally, you're sending an event, a custom deployment event, like we've seen in the very beginning of this presentation, to Dynatrace, so that Dynatrace not only knows, hey, there is a new container running, but we actually know this container runs version 1.13. It was triggered by this GitLab pipeline, and then you can add additional information. So this is what we call release observability. So we really know about what release has actually happened, more context for us. This context will later on help us in our AI, but it also feeds the release screen, so we can show you what version of which component is currently deployed. Then in the release automation, I guess I jumped ahead, but in the release automation, you have done a great job in calling one of your scripts that is automatically creating a dashboard for that release and showing me the 4 golden signals basically for that particular release, with also some thresholds from, I guess, a previous time frame. So that means you automatically get a dashboard that shows you the critical processes and services within that process, and it shows you availability, CPU, memory, traffic, errors, and so you immediately see how does the current behavior look like as compared to before we made the release. And that's awesome. So the dashboard is automatically created. And then the next step, I believe, if you go back to the pipeline, is the deployment validation. And this is where you're using our synthetic feature. So normally synthetics are used for production monitoring. So every couple of minutes, you run a synthetic test to validate if your application and your critical business transactions are still running. With the new capability to trigger synthetic tests on demand, I think you have 2 options. If you deploy into production, you can now trigger the synthetic test that you have and not wait until the next cycle comes in. That's one thing. But you can also specify synthetic tests that may not run on a schedule, that you just use for exactly that purpose of you have a new deployment and then you want to run a set of synthetic tests at this particular point in time to validate that your deployment was really successful, meaning your application is available and the critical business transactions work. And once this is done, we take it to another step, and we already know that the synthetic tests are good, but now we can take a look at the list of all sorts of metrics, front end, back end, and include this in what we call release validation, where we're calculating an SLO score across multiple dimensions of quality indicators. And this is what I love about kind of our approach and what you've demoed here, that everything is end-to-end fully automated.
Yes. Let me just make sure that one job finished off here. Okay, I think it did. So let's check one more time. I think I might have been in the wrong time frame. Okay, cool. So Cloud Automation got the sequence event. It ran the evaluation on a couple SLIs. It determined an SLO score. And we see the result of that SLO, the evaluation here. This is the event that gets fired back to Dynatrace, and we can see that it's linked within context of the release. So here's all that additional context here within the event. And then if we scroll down, we'll see the release validations that have happened. So here you can see all the different times we validated. I've ran a couple of validations over the last 24 hours. Every time it's failed or it's passed our conditions, we can now visualize that within Dynatrace.
So that's basically just looking at the same evaluation result events that you showed earlier in the list in a nicer, more use case specific way. So when did a release happen and what was the score? This is also great. Yeah.
Yep. So that's the full picture. We've fully automated our deployments. We've validated, we've made Dynatrace aware of the context of these deployments, ran a validation against the deployment to generate some data that we can then run a release validation on that data. And that's the full picture. That's kind of the beauty of what we just showed is it can all be automated. We can use the observability data in Dynatrace to feed those validations, and as well as execute the validation itself.
Can you do me one more favor? Can you click on the top left and the breadcrumb to the releases overview?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. Because this is really, really nice now, because you can see what we mentioned earlier. If you start integrating this, you can start easy with just sending a deployment event to a process group instance, and all of a sudden, that release with that version will show up here in this dashboard, so you know what is deployed where, and on the release events you actually see the details of that event. And if you're putting in a link back to your deployment tool, then it will be here. And then additionally, if you are using cloud automation, if you're using Dynatrace for automated release validation, where we're looking at these dashboards that are automatically then being analyzed, and we calculate a total score, you also see the history of which release was actually valued with which score. And that's pretty powerful. Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the demo piece.
Yeah.
Yes. So what have we learned with regards to Events API v2? Firstly, the context that we can provide Dynatrace about our deployments will improve your MTTR. So now our app support is aware of the context of deployments with problems. There's no longer a need to spend the time to identify what deployments have happened. We can simply get into the resolution of those problems. So that's one way we improve the MTTR with the context here. Another way is collaboration, right? Not only are you providing the context of the release, but you're providing who performed the release, what was the tool that was used to perform the release, all the information about who can we reach out to with regards to this release. That just simply provides that collaboration within our team. So no longer is app support on their own island, but now there's a direct correlation to our DevOps team and the app team that's sending this, that's pushing out this release. And then internally, we're using the Events v2 within our cloud automation module to enrich Dynatrace with the Events API v2 to run the validations, to run the releases. And so that's the three things I really wanted to make sure everyone got out of this call. Anything that you identified, Andy?
No, I think you said this perfectly. I mean, you also additionally showed the whole synthetic on-demand execution, which I really love. And you need to take a little bit more pride in what you have built. And this is why I want you to show again the Git repository.
Sure.
Because you made it look really easy, and it is easy, right? Once everything is fully automated. But you have built a really, really cool, even not only one, but a set of automation projects here that help our users to adopt these things in an even faster way.
Yeah, so we have a couple solutions. One is to actually automate your SLO. So defining a couple criteria, we can use Monaco to automatically generate these SLOs and a unique dashboard that visualizes your SLOs. Like what we discussed today was the release automation. So given some criteria, we can automate the release context into Dynatrace using the Events V2. Some release validation dashboards. This will feed the data that Cloud Automation is using to validate releases. A unique way of visualizing service flow. So visualizing service flow within context of every service that's related within the flow, as well as some predefined or automated baseline thresholds for the 4 golden signals for all these services within the flow. This visualizes fairly quickly when there's a downstream dependency that is having some issues with regards to response time, failure rate, and that impact upstream. And then finally, some 4 golden signals for what everyone loves these days, Kubernetes. So for Kubernetes, a top-down view of these services, we're exposing pods, containers, nodes, and some automated baseline thresholds for each one of these tiles. So that's what we've developed so far, and as we're holding these Cloud Automation Guild meetings, we're going to figure out more and more that our teams need, and figure out what other automations we can build out.
And
so this is all accessible. Yeah.
Exactly. And I just wanted to remind you, folks, if you're watching this, scroll down to the description of this video. You will also find a link to this particular Git repository. All right. Now with this last page, just a reminder who we are. And if you want to reach out to us, you can find us in the Dynatrace community. You can find us on social media, obviously. If you want to try something that you built, right? I mean, try it out on Git. And then if you have questions, then I'm pretty sure, AJ, you will be happy to then support our users that need some additional help or that have feedback. We're always open for feedback. And with that,
yes, of course.
With that, I want to say thank you so much for, I think, the 3rd or 4th time now that you support me with educating our community. And I'm pretty sure it was not the last time. Happy to see
Oh,
that.
yeah, we're definitely going to continue this. No, I learned so much from doing this. It forces me out of my comfort zone, and just learning GitLab, for example, that's something I've never done. So it's another tool set that I could build on.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to do this work with you as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, for this, goodbye. See you next time.
Goodbye. Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.